Greetings, friends, and welcome to In the Scriptures, where we explore a variety of topics from the Bible and their significance to the time that they were written in, and more importantly, their significance to us today. My name is Craig Fish, and I hope that our time together today will be as much a blessing for you as it is for me. Years ago, when I was a young man, I lived in the region of central New York State, and I had a friend that had family that lived over in Massachusetts. So we decided one day to take a road trip and go see his family. So he, myself, and a third friend of ours packed up a few things and took off for a weekend road trip. I drove the distance because I was the only one of the three of us that had a driver's license. We got to our destination, had an enjoyable weekend, and headed back home. Now, at the time, I was working as a pizza delivery guy, and as is the case with many young people, I did not have a tremendous amount of money at my disposal, but I had enough to do little things, like take an occasional short-distance road trip like this one. But this meant that I had to carefully calculate the amount that the trip would cost for things like gas, road tolls, and so on, and also how much that I would need to spend otherwise. My careful calculations led me to having a little more than enough money for the return trip home, so I thought I was in pretty good shape. Now, the driving distance was a little more than 6 hours one way, which meant we would have to stop along the way for gas. So as we went, sure enough, we got to the point where we needed to stop and fill the tank, and of course take care of a few other things that usually accompany a long road trip like this. And having calculated how much money I needed for fuel, and seeing that I had a little bit more than enough, I also decided to pick up some snacks for the road while I was at it. Then we were back on the road, three friends enjoying the road and tooling along at a good pace. We drove for about 2 hours when one of my friends noticed a sign for a city that we had already passed on our way home. You see, being a relatively new driver, and being pretty young as well, I wasn't paying nearly as much attention to certain things, and when we had stopped for gas and got back on the road, I mistakenly took the eastbound lane of the New York State Thruway rather than the westbound lane like I needed to. At this point, I had two choices to make. I could either A, continue going in the direction that I was headed and end up who knows where, or I could B, turn around and get myself back on the right track. Obviously, I took the very next exit and got us heading back in the direction that we needed to go in. And we all had a good laugh about it at the time, and honestly, for a little while after that as well. All of this, though, made us get home much later than I had planned, and it meant that I had far less fuel and money left over than what I had originally planned on having at the end of this trip. This, of course, is a story that many would chalk up to, say, the foolishness of youth. And they might say something like, well, you live and you learn. And while that might be true, there is a greater issue that underlies this entire story. You see, I laid my plans, and carefully so, or at least so I thought. I took all the right steps that I thought were needed for this journey that I and my friends were taking, and everything seemed to be going as planned. But there was one major piece that I had never considered in this whole trip, and that is that I was relying totally on the directions of my friend to get us where we were going, since he seemed to know the way to get to his family's home, and then get us started on our way back as well. And then I thought I knew enough from there to get us the rest of the way based solely on my own recollections of how we got to where we were, and that I could simply follow these same directions in reverse and get us back home. But here's the issue. I never bothered to read a map of the trip for myself, and along the way, I didn't bother to pay attention to the road signs to keep me going in the right direction. Too often, this same kind of thing happens to us in our journey with Christ through this world. We get started out and maybe we're doing okay. we see and hit some of those way markers that tell us we're on the right track, or at least we are told is the evidence that we're on the right track. But perhaps, as we go, we get just a little too comfortable with how we think we are doing, and perhaps end up relying a bit too heavily on how someone else is directing us along the way. Maybe we even take some time to read the roadmap for how this spiritual journey is supposed to go, but again, we fall into relying too much on how someone else is telling us we are to understand that map. Or we get to a point where we think that, based on what I know so far, this will be enough for me to figure out the rest. And there may be times when this can be true, provided that what we learned before was actually correct. Or perhaps we again start out okay, but then again we get a little too comfortable with how we are doing and how much we actually know about how our journey is to go, and end up not paying nearly as much attention to the signs along our way as we should, and end up getting sidetracked, or worse, getting completely off course and end up going in the totally wrong direction. It is of the greatest importance that we keep our eyes on Christ in our journey with Him. It's one thing to follow the example of another as a guide for what this journey with Christ should look like. But even then, we need to be very careful, no matter how trusted of a source that example may be. Note the words of Paul when he states, "Imitate me, just as I also imitate Christ." The King James Version puts it this way, "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Here Paul is telling us that it is okay to follow after him, but only as long as he is truly following after Christ. Now, what makes an instruction like this a bit difficult at times is because there are many cases where someone believes they are following after Christ, but in truth they are not. Christ referred to these kinds of circumstances when he stated, "They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, both will fall into the pit." Interestingly, the context of this statement that Jesus is making refers directly to the religious leaders of his day, leaders which were blinded by their own traditions rather than keeping their eyes on God and truly following Him by keeping His commandments. Because even in the very context of this statement, Jesus is referring to the religious leaders as encouraging others not to keep one of the 10 Commandments, namely, honoring their father and mother. Now, if the religious leaders of the time of Christ were perfectly capable of misleading the people, how much more so is it possible for the same thing to be true today? In today's study, we're going to see firsthand just how off course things have gotten when it comes to following Christ, and how that maladjusted course needs to be corrected. We're going to take a bit of a jump in our study of Revelation, in that in our last study we looked at chapters 12 and 13, but today we're going to look at some details from chapter 17. In so doing, we're going to see just how important it is to keep our eyes on Christ in our daily walk with Him. So without any further delay, let's get into our study of Revelation chapter 17. So some time ago, there was a gentleman who was traveling to Oakland. He was at the airport, had to get on board, and he finds the flight, gets on board, takes his seat, and before long, everybody who's flown in a plane, you know how it works. You have to wait for however long it is. The plane finally taxis out onto the runway, and whoosh, off you go into the air. Well, as the guy was sitting there enjoying his flight that he was anticipating to be relatively short because it wasn't a great distance he had to go, he found that the plane started turning out over the ocean. Didn't think anything of it. I mean, planes divert all the time for a variety of reasons, but 2 hours later, the plane was still over the ocean. And he asked the stewardess, how long before we get to Oakland? And she looked at her watch and said, it's going to be about another 9 hours. And he said, 9 hours? To Oakland, California? And she said, no, we're not going to Oakland, California. We're going to Auckland, New Zealand. So somehow this guy had gotten on the wrong plane, and when he finally got to Auckland, he found a way to get another plane and get back to his destination. But this is an example of somebody who was intending to go one place, but ended up going someplace else. Now, I'm sure, I've never been to Auckland. I'm sure it's nice. Maybe you would even have friends or family who live there, but if Auckland, New Zealand is not your destination, then you're heading to the wrong place, no matter how nice it may be. Sometimes we all have to have those course corrections. And the same holds true for our relationship with God. We are intending to go to one place, but along the way we get deviated and end up someplace else. And God is there to say, we need to make a course correction, because I want to bring you back to where it is that I want you to be, not necessarily where it is you think you want to be. Well, there are actually a number of examples of this very same thing that happened in the Bible. One example comes in the life of Elijah. Here we have this prophet of God who is living at the time of Jezebel, Jezebel being the wife of Ahab. And there has been great apostasy that has spread throughout the nation of Israel. They are all following after, most people pronounce it Baal, but it's Baal. Not that it really matters if you pronounce that right or not. Interestingly enough, though, the word Baal means husband. So this god that's called Baal or Baal, the word means husband. And isn't it interesting that Christ is the husband of his church, that the church is referred to as the bride of Christ? And so this false form of worship is trying to step into that role that God has reserved for himself of being the husband of his people. Well, Elijah went and told the king, he said, because of all the paganism, because of all the false worship, because of the fact that you are deviating so much from what it is that God has called you to do, and you're leading the people in this direction, there's going to be a drought for 3.5 years, no rain. And of course that really impacted a lot of, everybody. No crops, no rain. It was a really bad situation for 3.5 years. And then at the end of that point, Elijah finally reveals himself to the king again, and the king responds to him, and he says, is that you troubler of Israel? And then he says, I have not troubled Israel, but you and your father's house have, in that you have forsaken the commandments of the Lord and have followed the Baals. Well, then there comes this showdown that happens after that. So Elijah calls out the king, says, hey, you bring all your prophets and come to this mountain, and we're going to have a showdown to see whose God is really God. So there's these 2 altars that are built. All the prophets of Baal and what they call the prophets of the grove, that's different areas of trees where they would believe that different divine beings lived in the trees and so on and so forth. So they would have prophets that would be there, and that's where they also talk about in the Bible of going to the grove to worship. That's what that's referring to. They were all called up, and they were to see whose God is really God. And Elijah even gives them a statement right there. He says, if Baal is God, then follow him. But if God is God, then follow him. Either way, stop trying to teeter-totter between 2 decisions. Make a decision, make it firm, make your choice, stand on it, and let's see which one is really true. And whichever sacrifice is accepted, that will be the evidence of which is true. So make your decision now, and then let's have this test. How long will ye halter between 2 opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. But look what happens. So they took the bull which was given them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, O Baal, hear us. But there was no voice, no one answered. Then they leaped about the altar which they had made. So they cried aloud and cut themselves, as was their custom, with knives and lances, until blood gushed out of them. This is not a very pleasant scene that's happening, but yet nothing happened. The only thing that happened was they cut themselves. The God that they were worshiping was not responding in any way. And of course, if you know the story, Elijah starts to taunt them a bit. Well, maybe he's asleep and you need to cry out louder to wake him up. Maybe he's gone away on a trip. Maybe he's, occupying himself in other ways. But nothing happened. And at the end of all that, Elijah takes his altar, prepares his sacrifice, cuts up the bull, puts it on there, and then drenches the whole thing in water. And he's basically doing this to show that there is no way that what is about to happen can be manufactured. It's going to be so sopping wet that there's no way that I can make it look like I'm going to start this fire myself somehow. They drench everything. And then Elijah prays, and a bolt of fire comes down out of heaven and devours the entire thing. The sacrifice, the water, the stones of the altar, everything gets consumed. Now that's the power of God right there. And what ends up happening, but all the prophets of these false worshiping systems ended up being killed as a result of what happened here, because all the evidence was given that God of Israel, he is the only one and true God who is real, and what you have been following has been a facade this whole time that seeks to replace the worship of the true God. But then, it doesn't end there. Elijah prays again, and lo and behold, the skies open up a second time. Only this time it's not fire that falls, now it's rain, which is what they have been needing now for this 3.5 years. So the people have gotten their act back together, and God responds by sending them the rain that they have needed. But aside from that, this character of Elijah also appears to us in another form as well. In fact, the last book of the Old Testament mentions him very clearly. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Now, as we have been going through Daniel and Revelation, and we have seen how there are different phrases and terminologies that are used to refer to different things, what do you believe, based on how we have seen things referred to so far, that this great and dreadful day of the Lord is referring to? What is this talking about? It's talking about the second coming, the ultimate final judgment upon mankind, or should I say the execution of that judgment to take place. But we have some examples along the way as well of how this same spirit of Elijah emerges. So we have the book of Malachi. It's written somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 BC. And then there is prophetic silence on the part of God to his people for a period of almost 400 years. You talk about having to be patient and wait upon the Lord. 400 years, that's a long time. Many generations pass in 400 years that have not heard a prophet from God, a true prophet from God, that is. But then lo and behold, just as we have studied through Daniel, the time was appointed for Christ to arrive, and just before Christ arrived, there was a prophet to proclaim this very thing. Surely the Lord does nothing unless he reveals his acts through his prophets. So what is that event that took place? Well, Christ was born right on time, just like Bible prophecies told us that he would. Again, we look at the 70 weeks of Daniel, and that clearly delineates when it was that Christ would be born, and when he would also enter into his messianic ministry as well. But before he enters into that ministry, there's another guy who rises to a bit of a prominent position, his name being John the Baptist, who is proclaiming what? What is the message of John the Baptist? But turn from your sins, make straight a path for the Lord, and prepare ye the way, which is exactly, in different words, the same message that Elijah proclaimed. Turn from your sins and make straight the way of the Lord. So we see here in John the Baptist the spirit of Elijah calling people to action, to make not only a conscious choice, but physical actions as well that reflect a turning away from sin and a preparing of the way for the Lord, not just for some grand scheme, but more importantly in our own hearts and minds, so that we as individuals are prepared for the coming of the Lord. Well, we also see this very same thing again reflected to us in yet another form. We have been partly looking at what is called the three angels' message contained in Revelation chapter 14. In fact, if you recall, each night we have looked at just a little bit of those messages, slowly progressing through, and we'll take another look at that again today. But aside from that message, we also have, now this is a message that again calls people to turn away. First, it points out these systems of confusion that we have been looking at, and it is in a deliberate, intentional call to move away from those systems of confusion and set within our hearts and our minds who the true God is and to follow him. Make a confident, firm decision of what you're going to do and then do it. Stop faltering between two positions. Make your decision and stand on it. But then we also find something contained in the book of Daniel. So now in the book of Daniel, Daniel 1 starts out with Nebuchadnezzar coming to Jerusalem, seizing it, destroying it, and carrying captives off. We remember our study from Daniel 2. This was the dream that Nebuchadnezzar had. Then in chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar takes that dream and alters it, takes a truth of God and alters it to represent a lie that he deceives the people with. But he's the one who ultimately gets the trick played on him, because he's the one who has God truly revealed to him as he tries to destroy those that are true to God. But yet God shows up in a very real way and protects them, and he's the one who is revealed to what the glory of God is all about. Then in chapter 4, we have a story there as well of how Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind. But he's finally humbled as well. And the last thing that we see Nebuchadnezzar doing is praising and extolling the God of heaven. But then in chapter 5, we have another story as well. And this is one that sometimes gets a great deal of attention as well. This is something that is far more than just a kid's story. This is something that each of us, even here as adults, need to pay great attention to. Here we have King Belshazzar. He is now the ruler in the city of Babylon. And he decides that he is going to throw a great feast. Now, to set the context of what's happening, the city of Babylon is under siege from the Medo-Persian coalition. But if you remember in our discussion of Babylon, this siege of the city of Babylon meant nothing to the Babylonians, because the city of Babylon was situated in such a way that they could withstand almost any possible siege that could be delivered, because they had a water supply running right under the walls with the Euphrates River, and they had a whole section within the city where they could continue to grow crops to produce food with. So they had a constant food supply, a constant water supply. So any siege, which the whole point of a siege is to cut off any kind of, nothing comes in, nothing goes out, cut off your food supply, cut off your water supply. That's the point of a siege. But there's nothing that they could do to impact Babylon with a siege like this, because they had everything they needed to last almost indefinitely. As a result, Belshazzar decides that rather than be concerned about this siege, I'm going to have a party. So what does he do? Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that they had taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone in the same hour. Now, before I go any further, those first elements right there, gold, silver, bronze, and iron, does that sound familiar at all? Remember our study of Daniel 2, the very same elements, gold, silver, bronze, and iron. In the same hour, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now, incidentally, if we were to continue reading, we would see that this scared Belshazzar so much, the Bible tells us that his knees knocked together. This is a guy who literally got weak in the knees because of what he is seeing happen here. And I'm sure if any of us saw this very same thing, we would probably freak out a little bit too. But what was that phrase that was written there on the wall? It's Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And this is actually what that says right here. If you read across from this way, starting on this side, because again, remember, Hebrew orients to the right. So here we have Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. And then Daniel ends up being called before the king because nobody else knows how to interpret it. The mother of Belshazzar says, hey, there was this guy who served Nebuchadnezzar. He could interpret dreams, so let's call him. Now, Daniel, of course, is still alive at this point in time. So Daniel comes in, and he tells Belshazzar, my friend, your days are numbered. In fact, you have but moments left to live. And that very night, as the message is conveyed within Belshazzar's ear, He ends up perishing that very night because, as we have discussed already, what the Medo-Persians did is, of course, the river Euphrates did not naturally flow under the city of Babylon. It was diverted to do that. They built dikes and dams to divert the water to flow in that direction. So all they had to do, it's a wonder why it took anybody so long to figure this out, was to break those dikes and dams and let the river go back to its natural course. And lo and behold, now there's a nice dry riverbed for the Medo-Persians to march on, go right under the wall, right up into the city, and capture it in the midst of this drunken party that the Babylonians are having. And the record tells us that the only person who died that night, there could have been more, but the only person that we know for a fact died that night was Belshazzar. And then the kingdom is handed over to the Medes and the Persians. Darius, the Bible tells us, took command of Babylon, being 62 years old. Well, then we find additional parallels to this in the book of Revelation. Turn with me, if we will, to Revelation chapter 4 once again. We're going to read through those messages that I was talking about just a moment ago. Fear God and give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come. And worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and springs of water. Now, we're going to continue reading on here for that later on, but before we go, I'd like to introduce to you another individual that we haven't paid much attention to yet. In our last time together, we were introduced to this character that would be on your right. This is the woman dressed in white. The Bible tells us, now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Now, this is the last time we were together. We took a little bit of time to study about this woman. And what is it that we determined that she is, based on a complete description within the text? But this is a representation of God's pure church. But there's another individual that we need to pay attention to now, because later in the book of Revelation, there is somebody who comes to us in the very chapter we're looking at this evening. It's another woman, but this one is sitting on the back of a beast. And if we were to read the full description, which we're going to see part of it in just a moment, she is sitting on a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. Now, does that sound familiar to anything else that we've already looked at in the book of Revelation as well? Again, the last time we were together, we were looking at this beast that rises out of the sea having 7 heads and 10 horns. So this woman who is sitting on the back of this creature is connected with that same message from Revelation chapter 13. Not only that, though, but she is described in a particular way. And on her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. Now, if you remember from our study of Revelation 12 and 13, the woman that is clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, she gives birth to a male child, right? And we determined that is who? Based on the description within the text, that is who? That's Christ that she gives birth to. And then she is led off to a place that has been prepared for her for 1,260 days. We went through all of that last time together, so I'm not going to rehash all these details again. But we did see also that the dragon, who the Bible clearly tells us was Satan, was enraged with her and went to make war with the rest of her offspring. So now if she is somebody who represents a pure church, the rest of her offspring would be likewise those who are trying to follow the word of God as well. But look at this. Here this woman that we're looking at now, she is described as wearing purple, which means that she is not pure like the woman who's dressed in white. White is a symbol of purity. It's like that throughout the book of Revelation. But here this one is dressed in purple or scarlet. Some people call her the scarlet harlot. But on top of that, she is described as the mother of harlots, which means she has daughters. So if a woman is representing a church or a religious organization, then that means that she likewise is also giving birth to additional religious movements that are as corrupt as she is. Now, the first time that we see Babylon appear in the scriptures, it doesn't actually appear under the name of Babylon. It appears under the name Babel. And if you remember the story, here we have Noah's flood. The flood waters have happened. They have abated. Noah has come out. The ark has been opened. Everything is kind of continuing back the way that it was. Life is starting to have some semblance of normalcy to it again. But the people decided that I'm not going to believe God's promise. And what was God's promise to Noah after the flood? What does the Bible tell us? That he set a bow in the sky as a promise that he will never destroy the whole earth with a flood again. But the people decided, I'm not going to believe that promise. So therefore, let us build ourselves a great big tower that reaches to the heavens. And ultimately, this purpose was so that if and or when God decides to flood the whole earth again, we will have some place to go. But God said, you guys aren't listening. I gave you a promise. I gave you my word. In fact, not only did I give you a word and promise, but I have given it to you continually. Every time it rains, my promise appears to you again and again and again. It is a guaranteed promise from God that he's not going to flood the whole earth with water again. He will destroy the earth again, but it won't be with water. So these people were so confident in themselves, they built this tower, and then God says, you know what? Here's the thing. Nothing that man puts his hand to will be held back from him. Why? Because man at that point in time was too smart for his own good. Long life and great intelligence is a wonderful thing. But just like taking somebody who has political power and religious power and combining them into one person is never a good thing when you have that combination adequately seasoned with sin. So you take long life and great intelligence and you season that combination with sin, you have a recipe for disaster. Man was too smart for his own good. But the problem is he was also very sinful. My spirit will not strive with man. So God says, I'm going to confound their languages because they all spoke the same language. And I'm going to shorten their lifespan to alleviate this problem, at least for now, because we're still smarter than we give ourselves credit for. Just look at the technological advancements that have happened in the last 100 years. That's evidence that we're still too smart for our own good. But God reaches down, confounds the languages, hence Babel is associated with confusion, because all of these languages now have been put upon the earth so that people cannot communicate with one another in a way that would allow them to effectively continue this work that they were trying to do. As such, in the city of Babylon, there was actually an obelisk that was constructed as a monument to the Tower of Babel. In fact, they held this idea that that is actually where the Tower of Babel stood, is where this obelisk was erected. So what is it that they were putting an obelisk to? They were praising a punishment from God and the confusion that resulted upon the human race as a result of it. So they were actually edifying confusion. And that's what Babylon is all about. But on top of that, there is actually something else that comes along with it. This woman, notice how one of her names was Babylon the Great. So she herself is a system that promotes confusion. So what is it that we have here in the scriptures? And the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication, with the wine of her mixing with everything else. They were made drunk with it. Now, I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, and I'm not going to ask anybody to testify at this moment. I will simply give my own personal example. I have been in an altered state of mind more times than I care to admit. And when you are inebriated, you don't have clear judgment. And it becomes very easy to get confused. So here you have a system that is all about promoting confusion and at the same time making it look good. Because when you're in that kind of a state of mind, it all looks good. So that's the whole point. Make everybody confused and make it look good. In fact, make it more than look good, make it fun. Now more and more and more people want to keep doing it. Because not only does it look good, but it's fun too. But there's a problem that comes with that. As we have been looking through our studies of Daniel and Revelation, we have seen that this system of confusion has brought within Christianity teachings that are blatantly non-biblical, but yet at the same time now, because they have been propagated for so long, they are commonplace in the minds of the vast majority of people, whether you call yourself Christian or not. The majority of people, to some degree, hold to some of these ideas. One of those being that when you die, you don't really die. Well, what is it that the Bible actually has to say about this very topic? Ecclesiastes 9 verse 5 tells us very clearly, for the living know that they will die, but what else does it say? The dead know a little bit. The dead know a few things. The dead tend to look in upon the living from time to time. No, what does it say? It says the dead know nothing. Now, I want to make a quick point here, and that is that I have heard people say that this word here, that dead, simply refers to the dead body. The body doesn't know anything, but your spirit continues on. In fact, if we read later in Ecclesiastes, it tells us that the last chapter tells us that when the vessel is broken and the water is spilled out, this is a reference to death, that the spirit returns to God who gave it. And so, see, there you go. The spirit returns to God who gave it. However, if you follow that line of thinking thoroughly, what is it that God gave to mankind? Go back to Genesis, where the creation of mankind takes place. He formed the body out of the dust of the ground, breathed into the nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. So of those three things, the body, the breath, and a living being, which one of those three was given to mankind? It was the breath of life. The soul comes about as a result of combining the body and the breath of life, or the spirit. That's what the word spirit means. At death, it is that same combination reversed. The body goes back to the ground as it was. The breath of life, the spirit, the power to be alive that God gave us returns to God. And the soul, just as it was nothing before that combination was there, likewise again becomes nothing when those two things are separated. And at the resurrection, there's a new body that comes up. The spirit of life is given back to that body, and the soul wakes up again. And it could be 1,000 years have passed to that individual who was resurrected. It'll be an instant of time. No recognition of anything that has passed. That is the story. That is the clear teaching that the Bible gives us. But yet, there are texts that are pointed to say, no, that can't be right. We look at here, and this is, they say the dead body. Now, I will have to say this, that yes, there is a word in the Hebrew that says dead body, but that's not the word that's used here. Every time that word is used, it is always qualified with dead body or dead carcass. Every single time. This word that's used here simply means to be dead. That's all it means. On top of that, there is another teaching that also permeates within Christianity, having to do with the mark of the beast, 666. We looked at this a little bit last night, and I know it may have been a shock to some, but we're going to take a moment to look at this as well. If anyone worships the beast and his image and receives his mark in his forehead or on his hand, remember how it is that we talked about this identification of in the forehead or in the hand would have sent huge red flags to the Christians of the first century, because what is the Bible that they have at that time? It doesn't contain the New Testament. It's all the Old Testament. Then they would have well known their Old Testament, and this imagery of forehead and hand would have hearkened them to the same text we looked at last night back in Deuteronomy, where it talks about binding them upon your hand and upon the frontlets of your eyes. It's a direct reference to the law of God, but here it is a clearly satanic entity that is trying to replace the law of God with a law of its own that mimics what God has produced, but yet it is a lie. Just like Nebuchadnezzar took a truth of God and twisted it to a lie, so Satan has taken the truth that God gives us and twists it into a lie. It looks good, and in many cases it's even fun to keep doing it. And how bad can it be if it's really so much fun? I remember a TV show that was on not too long ago. I'm not going to mention the name of it. I'm not going to mention any characters. I don't know if it's still on yet or not. But here we have these characters that live lives on this show that are a direct abomination to what God says is good to do. Their characters are a direct abomination to what God says is good. And here these characters come in and they act so funny. They get everybody laughing. Ha 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 ha. Oh, it's so funny. How bad can it really be? And that's the ploy. Make it look fun. And nobody will really recognize how bad it truly is. So let's just go a little bit further here. Remember from some of our study last night, I'm going to look at one more statement. This is a quote from a guy by the name of Carl Keating. He writes, "It is the Catholic Church that decided Sunday should be the day of worship for Christians in honor of the resurrection. How many have ever heard we keep Sunday in honor of the resurrection? Now, how many of us say, I stand on the Bible and the Bible alone? I want to see a show of hands for that one. I stand on the Bible and the Bible alone. Show me from the Bible where there is any command at all, anywhere where we are to honor the resurrection. There's nothing. It is nothing but a pure tradition that crept up into Christianity through Catholicism that actually took paganism as its root and brought it into Christianity. And hence, Christianity, for the most part, has continued to propagate this same lie, and it has gone beyond Christianity because there are people who very loosely consider themselves connected with the Christian church, any Christian church that may be, and even they say, Sunday is the day we go to church. Why? Because everybody does it. I remember this one guy when I had my garage all those years ago, that I would work on Sundays, and I was in there. I'd usually be there by myself. I was working. I don't remember what it was I was working on. And this guy that I had done some work for before came in and said, hey, let's go fishing. It's Sunday. The Bible says we're supposed to take that as a day of rest. Now, this guy didn't go to church at all, ever. He was about as non-Christian can get. But he still makes these loose connections because these ideas are so commonplace that it's just what everybody does. And so he's following along with the flow of the crowd with no real recognition of what it is that he is promoting. What else do we have here? This is from Cardinal Gibbons. We read a statement or two from him last time together. Here's another one. This one from 1893. Reason and sense demand the acceptance of one or the other of these two alternatives, either Protestantism and the keeping holy of Saturday, or Catholicity and the keeping holy of Sunday. Compromise is impossible. So where does this all come from? These teachings that we find rampant throughout the Christian world and even beyond the Christian world, where do they all ultimately come from? Paganism, brought into Christianity through the papal church. And incidentally, this same idea of, when you die, you don't really die, it's not limited to anything related to Christianity. Buddhism holds to it. Hinduism holds to it, but it's different for them. There, depending on how you live, when you die, you'll come back as a flea or a cat or a dog or something else. Maybe you will upstage depending on how your life was lived. But it's the same idea. You don't really die. You just come back as something else. God said, in the day you eat of it, you will die. You will perish. Satan said, you don't really die. Who are we going to believe? Did Adam and Eve die? Yes, they did. Did they die that day? Yes, they did. Their spiritual connection with God was severed. So yes, spiritually there was a death. And an animal, incidentally, also had to die that very same day so that they could have coats of skin put upon them. But they did eventually go back to the dust where they came from. See, here's the thing. God gives us these messages. He gives us his 10 commandments. And we're going to see in just a moment how pertinent these commandments are to the lives of those who claim to follow God. Elijah called people to come back to the law of God, to worship him as God has determined he should be worshiped. John the Baptist called people back to a following of God, to worship God as God has determined for him to be worshipped, to make straight the way. That message will be coming again because, as Malachi said, behold, Elijah is coming again before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So that same spirit of the Elijah message is coming again. Why? Because God doesn't want us to be deceived. He doesn't want us to be tricked and fall for the lie. Let's take another look here. This is from the book, The Faith of Millions. This is from Reverend O'Brien. But since Saturday, not Sunday, is specified in the Bible, isn't it curious that non-Catholics who profess to take their religion directly from the Bible and not from the church observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Yes, of course it is inconsistent. But this change was made about 15 centuries before Protestantism was born. They have continued to observe the custom even though it rests up on the authority of the church and not upon the explicit text of the Bible. This observance remains the reminder of the mother church. Now, what was it that woman sitting on the back of this beast dressed in scarlet, what was she called? The mother of harlots. Interesting how there's a little connection right there. From which all non-Catholic sects broke away, like a boy running from his mother, but still carrying in his pocket a picture of his mother or a lock of her hair. So they're trying to run away, but they don't really get very far. And here's something else that I want us to pay very close attention to. This is another teaching that was brought into Christianity through Catholicism. Now, not quite as many Christian denominations hold to this, but there are some who still do. When the priest announces the tremendous words of consecration, he reaches up into heaven and brings Christ down from his throne. What is he talking about here real quick? Anybody know what he's talking about at this point? Well, let's keep reading. Maybe you'll catch this as we go. Brings Christ down from his throne and places him upon our altar to be offered up again as the victim for the sins of man. It is a power greater than that of saints and angels, greater than that of seraphim and cherubim. The priest brings Christ down from heaven and renders him present on our altar as the eternal victim for the sins of man. Not once, but 1,000 times. The priest speaks, and lo, Christ, the eternal and omnipotent God, bows his head in humble obedience to the priest's command. To that, every single one of us should say, wow! Remember how we talked about just the last time we were together about the blasphemy of this papal system. This is about as blasphemous as it gets right here. And what is it that this priest is talking about? This reverend, he's talking about Mass. Every time you go to take Mass, when they put that wafer in your mouth, for them, that is literally becomes the body of Christ in your mouth. And when you drink the juice that they give you, it literally becomes the blood of Christ in your mouth. Hence, every time they offer up Mass, they bring Christ from his throne and present him again and again and again and again as the offering of sin. But yet my Bible tells me, maybe your Bible says something else, but my Bible tells me that Christ offered himself up once for all. Not 1,000 times over and over and over again. These are all systems of confusion, doctrines that stand boldly in the face of what the Bible clearly delineates as being truth. And yet here we have yet again Revelation 14:8. Babylon is fallen, that great city. Now we're going to jump real quick into Revelation 18. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven. Now if you remember, as we were looking in Revelation, where John uses this term after these things, is not referring to necessarily a chronological sequence of events, but rather he's referring to I saw this, and now I saw this. They don't necessarily have to mean after this happened, then this happened. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that. So I just want to make sure that we keep that in mind as we're reading this, because that's a phrase, after these things, that John uses many, many, many times. After these things, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was illuminated with his glory. And he cried mightily with a loud voice, saying, Babylon the great is fallen, and has become a dwelling place of demons, and a prison of every foul spirit, and a cage for every unclean and hated bird. For all the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. The kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. And I heard another voice from heaven saying, Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, and lest you receive of her plagues. So when all of these systems of confusion have come into existence and continue to stand to this very day, what is the call that God gives but to step away from the confusion? Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins and in her plagues. There have been a lot of people through the course of time that have heeded that call, and it cost them their life. Some were burned alive, some were beheaded, some were imprisoned for long periods of time, some had all their property confiscated from them, some were what's called drawn and quartered. Anybody ever heard of what drawn and quartered is? That's where they lay you down on the ground and they tie a rope to each limb and then a horse at the end of each rope, and they say, Giddy up!
and you're pulled apart, drawn and quartered. All of these are ways that the church executed people who stood up in the face of the church and said, "You are wrong." The question is, will you be among them? That doesn't mean we're going to get drawn and quartered today, but there are other ways of punishing people that can be pretty bad at times. But we have to ask ourselves, do we want to be counted amongst those who would willingly count their lives worthy enough to sacrifice themselves for the truth of God's word, because knowing of what the eternal reward is that awaits them? The Bible gives us very clear instruction that it's His word that counts. It is His command that is to guide and direct us. It is what He has for us that we are to acquiesce to, not our own ideas, not our own theories or concepts of what the truth is, but what God's word truly tells us to do and to follow. God says, keep the Sabbath holy. And then He actually tells us, He comes right out and tells us what it is. It's the seventh day, not any one day in 7. You go ahead and pick, and I'll just make it holy, whatever day you want it to be. No, He very clearly says, the seventh day, keep that day holy. It is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Nothing else will do. Nothing else will replace it. The question is, will you allow yourself to be led by the Spirit that Christ has for us? Will you allow Him to truly be your shepherd that will lead you through a dark and dingy path that can be very dangerous to move through at times? Here we have Jesus speaking, "I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and I am known by them." How many of you have ever seen a shepherd with his sheep? And I'm talking a real shepherd with real sheep. It's really interesting what happens when you have a flock of sheep and a person who has spent the time with that flock, guiding and directing them. They tend to learn the voice of the one who is leading them. And I have seen many times where people try to call out to a flock of sheep, and they call and call and call, and they try to beckon them to come, and they just look over at them like, "Who are you, and why should I listen?" And then the real shepherd just says, "Come on," and here they come, because they know the voice of their shepherd. Do you know the voice of your shepherd, the one who you are claiming to follow? "Or my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus Christ. There really isn't another option. It's either you keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus Christ, or you don't. It can't be one or the other. It has to be both. It has to be both. And if you don't have both, you don't have anything. You're either all in or you're not in at all. We have a course correction that's being given to us. God says, "Follow me." What is your answer?
Do you hear the voice of the true shepherd calling you today, my friend? Because I can tell you He is calling. Christ is calling to you right now. He calls you to hear His voice and to follow His lead. He calls you to keep His commandments and to have the faith of Jesus. That faith of Jesus is to place our complete and total trust in God, to rely on Him to get us through when times are both good and rough, and everything else in between. Christ is calling you out today to follow Him. Just like a good shepherd leads his herds to good pasture land where there is food, water, and maybe even some shade, that same shepherd will also provide protection for his flock so that when there is danger, they can have a sense of calm. Because when that danger arises, they will run to the shepherd rather than try to take on that danger on their own. Our problem is that we often try to take on difficult challenges on our own without running to our good shepherd for help. Friends, if the course of your life has not included Christ, then take that time right now to make that course correction so that Christ is a very real part of your life. It's as simple as acknowledging yourself as a sinner and claiming the death of Christ as the payment that covers your sins. Then, living your life in such a way that demonstrates your gratitude for the grace and mercy that God has shown you through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. If your course of life has included Christ, but that course has not necessarily included keeping the 10 Commandments, including keeping the seventh-day Sabbath holy, then it's time to make that course correction as well, and follow the example of Jesus as it was his custom to keep the Sabbath holy. Following the example of Jesus that he gave us is the only safe bet, my friends. Remember what Jesus said, "If you love me, keep my commandments." When Jesus said, "Before Abraham was, I am," he was referring to the experience of Moses, when at the burning bush, Moses asked God who he should say was sending him, and God replied to Moses, "I am has sent me." The people that Jesus was talking to picked up very quickly on what Jesus was referring to, which is why they grabbed up some stones to throw at him because they thought he was claiming to be God. But he was right. They knew what he was saying. But more specifically, what Jesus was really driving at was that he was the one that gave the 10 Commandments to Moses. So the 10 Commandments are the commandments of Jesus. And Jesus says that if we truly love him, then we will keep his commandments, all 10 of them. Well, that is our time for today, friends. If you would like a DVD copy of this program, then get ready, because the email address that you can use to get in touch with us is coming up. And remember what is in the Scriptures. The stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Thank you for joining us today for In the Scriptures. It is our great pleasure to have been a part of your day today. If you would like to ask any questions or have a comment regarding the material that is covered on today's program, then I would invite you to send us an email at contact@inthescriptures.com. That's contact@inthescriptures.com. We also have a free offer this month. It comes to us from the ministry It Is Written and is simply titled, "Can God Be Trusted?" If you would like your free copy of this study guide, then send us an email at that same address of contact@inthescriptures.com and let us know how to get your free copy of Can God Be Trusted into your hands. If you would like to participate in a thoughtful, rational, and edifying dialogue regarding any of the material that is covered on In the Scriptures, then we will be happy to correspond with you in an edifying and intelligent manner. It is our mission to engage with you, the viewing audience, in a respectful and thought-provoking way, so that all of us as people can be built up and strengthened in the Word of God, and more importantly, that Christ is glorified. Once again, that email address is contact@inthescriptures.com. Thank you again for watching. Have a wonderful and Christ-centered day. Hello friends, recently the news has been full of stories about the coronavirus. Accompanying these stories has been a level of fear that is demonstrated by empty shelves at stores across the country. But the Bible tells us that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. We are also told not to be afraid of the terror by night and not to lean on our own understanding, but in all our ways acknowledge the Lord, and He will direct our paths. So during this time of uncertainty, yes, we should do all we can to take care of ourselves and others. And don't let fear drive your decision-making. Rather, ask God for the peace that passes understanding, and He will direct your paths. I'm Craig Fish, and let's remember to live every day according to what is in the Scriptures.